Hi everybody. In this week's discussion board number 1, you are asked to talk about something that could be considered a virtue in one culture that might be considered a vice in another culture. And then you're supposed to talk about how that might lead to ethical relativism. Relativism is the idea that there is no universal standard in ethics, and that depending on the culture, there are different forms of relativism, but basically the idea is that depending on the culture, the context, the environment, the family, we've all been taught different things about what's right and wrong. Our society has determined, for example, that people have the opportunity to vote or the right to vote, whereas in another culture, citizens might not have that opportunity. So our society works. This other society where maybe only a certain ruling class has the opportunity to vote, that society seems to be working as well. So which one is better? Oh, well, we don't know. So one method is right in one context, and then the other method is right in the other context. Some people might think that in our society, women have as many rights as men. Even though those rights aren't distributed evenly, at least women are allowed to have jobs. Women are allowed to pursue education. They can live on their own without men, and they don't need to suffer for that. Whereas in another society, a woman might not be allowed to have a job, or might only have a certain set of jobs that she can work. And I'm not saying that that's not the case in our society, but there is a wider range in our society of jobs that women can have than, let's say, in Yemen. So in another society, it might be the case that women can't work, that women are forced to marry men, that in some places they're not even allowed to show portions of their body in public, portions that you and I might find fine. So for example, is it acceptable for a woman to show skin on her shoulder? Well, in our society, obviously, it's absolutely fine. While certain really conservative people might think, oh, well, yeah, I don't want to do that, like the Amish, or like, certain religious groups that cover their entire bodies all the time. But most of people in our society, give me a break, you go to the beach and you see like everything, right? Except, there's like a little strip of cloth that covers like little regions or whatever. But people are like, oh yeah, that's okay. If you go to Europe, it's even more free in some places. Go to Black's Beach in San Diego, there's a bunch of naked guys walking around. Illegally, I think, but nobody enforces it. So what's right? Is it acceptable but let's not take an extreme example. Let's just say like a tank top. A woman's wearing a tank top, it's showing her shoulders, her neck, and things like that. That obviously wouldn't be acceptable in many countries that follow Muslim laws. That wouldn't be acceptable in other places in the world. So women can't show even their shoulders. I was once in a mosque in India, and we were traveling with a girl, and she raised her hand to point at something, and her stomach showed. Her shirt came up, and the person, I don't know what his function was in the mosque, but he became very upset, and he told us to leave the mosque. So what's right? Is it right for women to be able to show their shoulders or skin? Or is it right in this other culture? In the other culture, it's wrong to do that. So in the other culture, it would be right for a woman to cover pretty much all of her body while she's in public. So the question is, well, who's right and who's wrong? And a lot of people say, well, we can't really say who's right and wrong. So therefore, there is no fundamental right when it comes to, for example, wearing clothing. And people tend to extrapolate that idea. And a lot of people who think about these things don't do this, but in general in society, people might say, well, you can't judge other people, or we can't judge other cultures. And most people, myself included, would say we absolutely can and ought to judge not only other cultures, but our own. Again, it's very difficult to find those moral fundamental standards, but let's take another example. So you're taking this class with me. I'm your professor. What if I said to you, well, you know, I don't like men. So every male in my class is going to get an F, and every female in my class is going to get an A. And that's the way that I'm going to run my class. How would you respond to that? Well, you would probably say, well, that's not fair. Well, fairness in itself requires a certain knowledge of some absolute. And if you're going to tell me, well, it's not fair that you give me an F and you give the girls an A, just based on nothing, then what you're doing is you're ascribing to a non-relativistic position. And I think even the women in the course would say, yeah, that's not really fair, Justin. You should grade people based on their performance in relation to the work that they do. Even though it would probably be, though there would be a couple who would say, oh yeah, I'll take the A. But most people in general, when you provide this example, will say, oh no, I want to be judged by my performance and by attributes that I have that aren't relative to my gender. So that's a simple example that shows that it's really hard to be a relativist. If you were a relativist, then you would need to say, okay, Justin, it's your class, it's your social environment, you've created it, and so I'm going to abide by those rules. Just give me my F. We can go even more extreme, and this is where it's hard to really be a relativist. There's a great article by Martha Nussbaum about female genital mutilation. It's sometimes called cutting or female circumcision. It occurs not only in Africa, in some places in Asia, and it occurs actually in the US in some places. We just don't hear about it. But what happens is, at some point in a young girl's life, they take a knife or scalpel or something, and they cut off her labia and clitoris or portions of it. And in Nussbaum's article, to her credit, she goes into all the different forms. Some are much more violent and grotesque than others. And she presents it as an example for the relativist, right? Can we say that because people in that culture believe that women ought to have their labia and clitorises cut off, but we don't, can we say that what they're doing is wrong? Are we allowed to, as a society, step in and say, hey, look, you cannot do this to little girls. This is a travesty. It's a human rights violation. And even apart from that, it's just strange that you would inflict such harm. Something in us there's this moral intuition that's just, I mean, you can imagine if I brought a little girl into this video, right? And I was like, okay, everyone, now we're going to do our female genital mutilation for the day. And I spread her out here and then laid her down and started doing this. I mean, I would go to jail forever. I would, in our society, I would, I mean, I wouldn't have this job anymore. You'd be traumatized for life. And the video would be banned, like, locked away in some locker. And so that shows the difference. I mean, in this other society, parents readily, well, not so readily if you read these articles, but parents say, okay, you're allowed to do this. Go ahead, take my daughter, go ahead and do this. And then she comes back, and then there's all these complications, right? So there seems to be something where we need to be able to say, no, that's wrong all the time. Other examples are just murder, rape, violent crime, abuse of women, and men, but that tends to happen more to women. It seems that most ethicists would say, no, we need to have rules that go against these forms of behavior. It seems that most ethicists would say there are some fundamental principles that guide human moral intuition. Now, of course, there's always going to be the psychopath in the corner that's like, yeah, I want to kill everybody, right? But just because there's one example of somebody who desires to destroy humanity doesn't mean that a majority of us aren't functioning, or that there might not be some principle that we can use to evaluate others' actions. Now, do we usually step into societies where people are violated in this way? No. I mean, we're not going to go to war in Africa. Why for these young girls? we tend to go to war for political reasons. Although sometimes we say that we're going to help these people, there are always other larger political, economic, and social factors, reasons why we go to war. Although hopefully in the future, people might stand up in cases of genocide and things of that nature. But so in this discussion board, you are asked to identify something that might be considered a virtue in one culture and a vice in another, and then how that leads to relativism. But I've given you a couple examples here that display the difficulty of finding the relativist position. Going back to Nietzsche in his Genealogy of Morals, he talks about how in ancient societies there was virtues like strength and virtues like enslaving other people. So the Romans, one of the virtues of Rome was that they wanted to conquer everyone. And so in that society, when you conquered another people group, it was like, wow, you are amazing, you are virtuous, we love you. Whereas now, although we do the same things in different ways, or the same things have been done in different ways, not quite as overtly, people wouldn't say, oh, well, you're a virtuous human because you took over 20 people who lived in your neighborhood. So things change, right? So virtues, even over time, change. So anyway, in this discussion board, you're asked to talk about a virtue in one culture that might be a vice in another, and the danger of relativism. But always in your mind, keep thinking about those things. And then the next time that you want to say something like, oh, well, we can't judge, think a little bit more about that. Ought we judge? Is it the case that we ought to be judging other cultures that don't allow women to have equal rights as men? Is it the case that we ought to judge cultures, and I'm including our culture as well, ought to judge cultures that consider certain ethnic groups to be lower than others? I mean, in our culture, even just 50 years ago, African Americans were considered lower than whites. I mean, that was just truth. Now, it wasn't, I'm not saying it was the truth. I'm saying back then, it was well known in society, right? Especially in the South, I guess. Oh, well, this is just the way it is. This is, this people is lower than this people, and then we enact these changes within our society. Was that right? I mean, if you're a relativist, you would just have to say that the changes that have occurred since the civil rights movement are just changes. That just back then it was different, now it's different. It's not better now. It's the same. I mean, back then what they did was right. I mean, having the police have dogs bite high school students in the streets just because they were black, that was right. But now it's not right. No, I mean, most people wouldn't say that. Most people would say that what happened when the people, the civil servants who were supposed to be protecting society were like spraying kids and people with water hoses and like harming them. And everybody was just standing around like, yeah, this is exactly what should be happening. Thank you, policemen. Thank you, firemen. You are, yeah, we love you. No, most people would say that was wrong and that we've come a long way, and that African Americans and Latinos and Asian Americans are no different than whites, and that also they should have the exact same rights. Although again, our societal structures continue to distinguish class along the lines of ethnicity as well. But again, we are fighting against that. Well, we feel like we're making moral progress. If we're making moral progress, that means we're working toward a goal. Working toward a goal means that there is some fundamental end or some fundamental principle that's driving us there. So that's a little bit or a lot about relativism. And good luck with your first discussion. And remember, don't just respond to two people. Remember, push yourself. Don't just do the minimum. Don't just say, oh, good post. Oh, I totally agree. I like puppies too. No, push yourself. Engage the ideas. Utilize your textbook. Go to the web resources that I provide you. Read about those things, and really try to understand what's going on in this course. The more time that you put into this course and into the development of the mind, the more the impact will be in the future, and the more that you'll get out of this education that you are using hard-earned resources to pay for. So good luck with your first discussion board.